Welcome to the Oncology Journal Club ASCO Special episode, Part 1. Here we take a famously different approach to oncology research. If you're looking for an enlightening and entertaining take on ASCO 2024, the OJC team has you covered with their unique blend of expert analysis and humour. Our hosts go beyond the usual presentations to highlight how the research will impact clinical practice. I'm your producer, Rachel Babin from the Oncology Podcast. Joining me are our amazing hosts, Professor Craig Underhill, Dr. Kate Clark, and Professor Christopher Jackson. For additional insights and links to all the papers, visit the show notes on oncologynetwork.com.au. And don't forget to check out Part 2 of our ASCO Special. If you or your organisation are interested in podcast sponsorship, advertising or production opportunities, please reach out to us at info@oncologynetwork.com.au. This episode was proudly produced by the podcast team at the Oncology Network.
G'day, kia ora, kia ora. Welcome everybody to this OJC podcast special, post-ASCO thoughts. So many of you will be attending or planning to attend some post-ASCO webinars or face-to-face meetings in various cities throughout Australia and New Zealand. This is something a little bit different. We're going to be interpretive dancing some Kaplan-Meier curves and describing them orally, which will be interesting, but this will be our take on some of the potential practice-changing interesting data from ASCO. So welcome, Professor Jackson.
Kia ora.
Coming live from Invercargill tonight, understand.
Yeah, I've got the great privilege of visiting a marae in Invercargill to do a hui on kids care, which is a really important issue in this population down south, talking about both ethnic inequalities and cancer outcomes and also issues around rural access to care as well. So great to be down here in Invercargill. Looking forward to the hui tomorrow and beaming in for ASCO.
Explain a hui. Oh, that's like something, it probably means something different in Australia.
Yeah, well, a hui is... It's quite hard to describe as part of our cultural vernacular. It's a meeting on a marae which has a very strong cultural component to it, a formal welcome, usually which is called a porphyry, where you're welcomed onto the marae, which is a Māori meeting house. And then you have the meeting and then you have a lot of food, eating, talking, a lot of good rhetoric, sharing of ideas, a lot of connection, and then finishing with karakiri or prayer and then closing. So it's going to go all day and it's going to be great.
Yeah, good on you. It's a bit of a privilege to be asked to do something like that. Fantastic.
It's a huge privilege.
And Invercargill's right down the bottom of New Zealand. Is that right?
Well, we would call it the most southern point rather than down the bottom.
Yes,
but, you know, as a correct oncologist, to being at the bottom of New Zealand is probably quite appropriate.
Welcome to Dr. Kate Clark. Kate, you went to a hui with 50,000 of your closest mates in Chicago. How was it?
It was great. First time since COVID for me. And just amazing. I was just telling the boys I got to finally meet Dr. Mark Lewis, and we've done a Mark Lewis Meets previously on OJC, so please have another look at it. An amazing oncologist, just an all-round nice guy. And yeah, 50,000 people in a room. I'd forgotten what the buzz felt like. It was just uplifting, really uplifting.
Yeah. Okay. We'll put the link into that OJC Meets episode with Mark Lewis. I'm just going to pull you up there, use the term post-COVID.
Yeah.
So I don't know what it's like in New Zealand at the moment, but here we're right in the middle of it. There's huge impacts still on the health system. So post-lockdown is probably the more politically correct expression, I think.
Yeah, no, you're probably right. I think I'm, like many, feeling more than a little burnt out by the whole concept. And, you know, that isn't a very responsible attitude. I'm with that, but that's my emotional response to the whole thing. So, no, I would agree with you. We are still mid-COVID. It's still a problem. Get your updated boosters ASAP, please.
Yeah, that's right. Chris.
And just checking in on that, Kate, too, did you also get to the Second City Comedy Club in Chicago this time?
I even took some colleagues who'd never been to stand-up before, and we had a ball. Yep, had a ball.
Fantastic.
And go to Spotify, Frank Turner and the Sleeping Souls went to a gig on the first night, which is interesting with that amount of jet lag. Brilliant gig.
We went to U2 at Chicago Fields one year. That was pretty bloody amazing. But yeah, let's put a link to Spotify to this hot new band. Don't you love the OJC? You're not going to get that at the post-ASCO meeting at some restaurant in Sydney or Melbourne. All right, Kate, do you want to kick off? Tell us what you thought was some of the potential exciting or practice-changing abstracts of the meeting. There was lots in the ASCO Daily News and featured in the media about breast cancer. So what took your eye there?
I struggle because I do treat breast cancer and I enjoy looking after people with breast cancer, but it feels so much further down the research track that maybe the excitement is a little bit fringy, though, rather than the big movements that are happening in the cancers that are catching up. But I did get up at 7:30 in the morning in Chicago to go to LBA 1000, which was Destiny Breast 06. So this is, I think, fascinating for those of us getting to learn to use trastuzumab deruxtecan and other antibody conjugates that are targeted-esque. So this was patients with HER2 low or ultra low. So to be defined as HER2 low, you had to have HER2 IHC 1+. Were you allowed 2+? You definitely weren't allowed to be FISH amplified, or just the ultra low just had a blush. So some staining on their HER2 IHC, so a little blush. And they gave them trastuzumab deruxtecan at second or later line in those patients who were also ER positive, who had also had what we would now consider standard of care, so endocrine therapy and a CDK4/6. The comparator arms were capecitabine, nab-paclitaxel, and paclitaxel, so appropriate comparators. And the difference in progression-free survival was 13 months versus 8 months, so, significant 5 months different. Obviously, OS is going to take a bit longer to read out. So really, really interesting, because this is supposedly a antibody conjugate that is aimed at HER2, but you don't need a lot of HER2 for it to gain benefit. So is that because it's leaky? Is that because we've got the story up about HER2 expression up the yin-yang? I think there's an awful lot of research still to be done. We've still got problems with interstitial lung disease in this drug. So this is still something that needs very careful, very expensive monitoring. And just as an aside, there was a Chinese group that have invented a anti-HER2 antibody conjugate that they thought would be better as it's more stable, so less leaky, that actually had higher rates of ILD and introduced new ophthalmologic toxicities. So I think we're still in the infancy of understanding how these things work. These things work, we know that, we're not 100% sure how, and the toxicity management is tricky. So that was my one breast cancer banger.
So tell me, Kate, about this HER2 ultra low. So if you add up HER2 ultra low with the blush that you mentioned, and then the 1+, 2+, 3+, how much is what proportion of breast cancer does that cover off on?
Yeah, so it pretty much only, there's very few people who are excluded. I think it was 20% in total. So if you include your genuine triple negative breast cancers and your genuine ER positive HER2 absolutely nothing, it's only about 20% of all breast cancers. So it is now a no-brainer to have trastuzumab deruxtecan, at least as a thought, for most people with breast cancer. At the moment, still in later lines of therapy, but that's a huge population of people.
Yeah, there you go. Interesting, Chris.
So, Kate, is it hitting the target?
Kate's doing a shoulder shrug.
Big shoulder shrug. Nobody made any effort to explain what we're actually looking at. So I think there is some thought that what we're seeing is HER2 changes all the time and all you need is a little bit of this to direct the drug to where it's supposed to be going. Or are we looking at something that's particularly, I haven't seen any data in the HER2 zero population, and that will be, I think, really interesting. So does it even matter? I think that will be really interesting indeed. I remember back in the day when Chris and I are very similar ages, when trastuzumab was a brand new drug. And we knew it worked, but it took a long time to figure out how it worked. And I feel like we're in that place with these drugs at the moment. The assumption is they're a target and a chemotherapy and you're targeting that, but I'm not sure that's true. I think there's other stuff going on there we don't understand.
Yeah, that was very much the same for cetuximab, wasn't it? EGFR expression being a poor prognostic marker, and then degree of EGFR expression didn't actually correlate with cetuximab activity, and, groups didn't benefit. And then, of course, the RAS story. I guess, HER2 is expressed quite broadly on many normal tissues and to a certain extent in normal tissues. So the off-target hitting of a drug-antibody conjugate, I guess, is a concern. That's where the ILD comes in. Are there other toxicity signals, Kate?
Well, no, that's what I think was really interesting, is that there doesn't appear to be an excess cardiac toxicity, or maybe we're just getting really good at looking at that and looking after that. The Chinese one that had the ophthalmologic toxicities, I hadn't heard about that, about trastuzumab deruxtecan. So that is interesting too. What's different about their drug? Is it the epitope of HER2 they're aiming at? Is it their cytotoxic payload? Yeah, again, the jury is out. So I think lots and lots of questions. Of course, the biggest toxicity of trastuzumab deruxtecan at the moment is the price. And it is, even with cost shares and access programs, it is still at the obscene end of.
How obscene, Kate? What number?
Oh, I can't even remember, because I've literally just started my first lady this week. It is in the order of tens of thousands of dollars a dose every 3 weeks.
Yeah, okay. I was hoping to get through an episode where we didn't talk about drug costs, because it's all a bit depressing. And one of the
financial toxicity.
Yeah, one of the things about going to ASCO, it's this American feast, isn't it, where you just everything's bigger and better, and abstracts that would be plenaries at other meetings are tucked away in a poster or in a small room. But let's just put a caveat on tonight's episode that we're just presenting the data, and of course a lot of them, Kate just mentioned the endpoints of this study were progression-free survival. Some of those I'm going to talk about had that as the primary endpoint, which of course we would disagree with, but we'll put costs aside and just talk about the results so we can get through in time. Are you happy with that?
No, Craig, no, I'm not, because drugs are only any good if the patients can access them.
Fair enough. All right. Asterisk it. Good on you. Kate, what else took your eye then? If there was nothing else much in breast cancer that you're excited about, what made you excited?
The lower GI abstract session was a banger. It was more exciting than the plenary. And it was exciting for those of us who work in MDTs, because actually of my 3 next abstracts, only one is about medical oncology. The other 2 are about surgery and interventional radiology. So.
What?
Exactly. You know, cancer is a team sport, and I think it's really important that we enlist our team members. So, but let's see, we're literally in the order they come up on my tabs on the computer. Andrea Sursek presented an update, durable complete responses to PD-1 blockade alone and mismatch repair deficient locally advanced rectal cancer, and that is LBA 3512. And now with 41 patients completing treatment, every single one has achieved a clinical complete response. Median follow-up of 28.9 months. Not a single person has required any local therapy or had systemic relapse. Now, interestingly, this is DMMR rectal, which is left-sided, so where the BRAF DMMRs don't tend to hang out. She only has one in her cohort who's BRAF mutant. So they did identically, but it's just curious whether that's an artifact of the population being a rectal cancer, very left-sided, or whether that will bear out something in the future. But absolutely fantastic. You know, those waterfall plots and swimmers plots are not changing. How much longer we have to go, the naysayers to be quiet, will be interesting. 3 years, 5 years.
Yeah, wow. So that's pretty exciting. This is further follow-up of the previously presented. This is the trial done at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Is that correct, Kate? So this is a longer follow-up of the same cohort.
Yeah, and of the cohort, there is an international phase 2, which is, I think, we've got about 160 patients on it, but that is yet to read out. But that, again, will be interesting because it's across different different hospital settings in different countries. The other interesting that came out of London, but I'm terribly sorry, I can't remember whether it was UCLH or whether it was the big place in Surrey. I think it was UCLH, that 9 weeks of pembrolizumab in DMMR patients, and they got a 67% pathological complete response with just the 9 weeks. So I think the 6 months of disitamab, is that necessary? There's a lot of translational correlative studies being done to look when response happens, what's the best guidance of response, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we will be watching this with interest. But if I had DMMR rectal cancer, I think I would be wanting a discussion with an oncologist about immunotherapy, and I think I would be trying to avoid surgery if at all possible, if I could have very significant surveillance.
Yeah.
So, Kate, I may be one of those naysayers. I mean, I think in some ways this population is primarily Lynch rather than what we see in clinical experience, certainly in our part of the world. So I think that's really relevant. And I also think the other critical thing to remember is that dMMR colon and rectal have an extraordinarily good outcome anyway, stage 2 and stage 3. So in my mind, this is about morbidity reduction, not about mortality, because the majority of these people, 80% plus, don't relapse anyway. So it's about organ preservation. And I think organ preservation is a really important outcome in rectal cancer. In colon cancer, where your mortality is around about 0.5 to 1% anyway for elective admission, and your morbidity for immunotherapy is 5% plus for disabling disease in a disease which can be cured by surgery anyway, we have to be careful about not jumping on the technology bandwagon and being thoughtful about how we weigh those up. The same, we had that was a NeoPrism study with pembrolizumab you mentioned, and we had the Niche 2 study, which was a Opdivo in dMMR colon cancer, also showing extraordinary response rates. In terms of a downstaging therapy, I think that's really important for minimising surgical morbidity, and also in people who are not fit for operations. But as a straight-out substitute for an operation, I think we have to weigh that quite carefully.
Yeah, I said rectal for a start. So I think rectal's different. I am premenopausal woman. I don't want my pelvis irradiated, right? So that's a straight up, thanks very much. I would rather hold on to my nether regions as they are. So I think that's a more complex conversation. I find it fascinating what to do with the niche data in those patients who don't require downstaging. I agree with you. If they look primarily unresectable, they look tricky to resect, cool, downstage sounds like a good plan. But all of the lynches, you're going to take their whole colons out at some point anyway. So it does kind of seem odd. Again, I find that fascinating. So I was very excited to see that we don't seem to have, at least at 28 months, a late relapse or a distant relapse problem. So I think intellectually this is fascinating.
I agree with that. And I also think that you're absolutely right, Kate, that TNT is highly morbid and that it is worthy of reducing morbidity. But I think we have to be very clear as to what we're doing, which is about a modality switch from surgery to drug therapy.
Look, the other thing that I found absolutely fascinating, because I know in our MDT, we often talk about using RFA in those patients who are medically inoperable. So this is collision trial. I'll put the horse back in front of the cart. Collision trial, surgery versus thermal ablation for small-sized colorectal liver metastases, and it is abstract 3501. So what this group did was they randomized patients who had less than or equal to 10 colorectal liver metastases and nothing outside of the liver to either, got to get this straight because it was a little bit tricky, either thermal ablation or surgical resection. Now, in real life, what actually happened was some of them got a combination thereof, but they were analysed in their intention to treat groups. And surgical mortality was 2.1%. Nobody had a grade 5 event due to thermal ablation. And it was very clear that it is non-inferior to choose RFA over surgery because it's a non-inferiority trial that obviously can't claim superiority, but there numerically at least was, probably due to the patients that you lose at time of surgery. So I think that's really exciting because it's rather than having a whole deroofing or a big shark bite scar, you may have a wee scar if access is an issue, but otherwise you can have it percutaneously. The vast majority of these patients did have percutaneous RFA, and it's an overnight stay in hospital, home. Brilliant. So I think that was really exciting.
Yeah, Kate, I think the open versus transcutaneous RFA is a pretty big difference, isn't it? The open RFAs are often been superior to the percutaneous ones, and seeing the percutaneous ones deliver is important for clinical practice. And like you say, it's a quicker recovery too, isn't it? Have you found that people are hesitant to use thermal ablation in your clinical practice?
Look, I think it has been considered a second option, like for patients who were older, who had anaesthetic risk. I like this data because it suggests to us that we can use the cheaper, more efficient, more patient-focused and not lose any advantage. I think that's fantastic. The only perhaps advantage you're losing is you're not gaining tissue, which, for oncologists and translational research, we love a bit of, no meat, no treat and all of that. But I think the last person that I was involved with who had RFA was 84, and he is now disease-free and well out to 86. And that's really exciting. We went to see him on the round the next morning, and he's like, Kate, I don't know why I'm still here. Can I go home, please? So very exciting, and it's always nice to see something that requires less morbidity to get the same outcomes. And then the final thing I want to talk about, and I know that many people around the world will be talking about this abstract for a long time, is abstract number 3500, transmet. So this is chemotherapy and liver transplantation versus chemotherapy alone in patients with definitively unresectable colorectal liver metastases. This is an incredibly brave trial. So French, Canadian, and Italian group, I think, if I got that straight, and they randomized patients between best possible chemotherapy or chemotherapy and liver transplant. How that practically worked was patients were selected by their local MDTs who had liver-only metastasis and had had a period of disease control on chemotherapy, and it didn't have to be very long. And then they were referred on. 140 odd, 150 odd were referred to the group, and they ultimately randomized 40 odd in each. So the reason why people didn't get randomized is if the local group thought that was stable disease, but the central group thought that it was actually progressive disease on chemotherapy, they were excluded. There were some people who were excluded due to small pulmonary nodules the local team hadn't thought relevant. And there were some patients who the central team said, I can resect that. So they were defined as resectable when the local team had thought they were unresectable. The patients were in the majority, though it was not mandated in the protocol, left-sided or RAS-RAF wild-type patients. The chemotherapy was paused. They went on the transplant list and they were to be transplanted within 2 months. And that happened for the vast majority of patients. And the intention to treat analysis, the 5-year overall survival was 57% in the transplant arm versus 13% in the chemotherapy alone arm. And in the per protocol analysis, which is a bit sneaky, but I think is something that you could discuss with a patient who's made it past transplant, the overall survival rate was 73% versus 9% in those that had only received chemotherapy. More interestingly, the median progression-free survival after transplant was only 17 months. More than half of patients had a second site of radical therapy, mostly to the lung. And again, I think that speaks to what we're learning about lung mets and colon cancer being a slightly different beast than lung mets elsewhere. So this is where I've always been a naysayer. The patients have always asked, can you just transplant me my liver, please? And I've always said, no, that's rubbish. And it was an absolute contraindication, a decade ago. But no, it looks like for a small select group of people should be an option if we can find enough livers.
Yeah, so Kate, I was going to raise that last issue because, we've always, I think the teaching was that there'd been some pilots of it and people didn't do well because of the immunosuppression. And in fact, they might do worse with the transplant than having chemotherapy. So this really turns that on its head.
Yeah, totally upset my biases. I think they were very circumspect.
Look, I found that really fascinating. I think with the transplant, what I found so fascinating was that the 3 to 5 year PFS was only 20% in the transplanted patients versus 0% in the people who got chemotherapy. So actually, you're only curing a very small number. So largely, it's about cytoreduction in that group. And Kate, my experience has been exactly the same as yours, which is people have always said to me, "Can you transplant me?" And I've always said no, because no data, etc. And also the fears about immunosuppression, which really weren't borne out in this. But the improvement in overall survival, man, that's staggering. And I completely agree with you that the issue is going to be around about the availability of organs to transplant to get that addition in disease control.
The interesting thing that the presenter spoke about was that although they had an agreement with their liver transplant groups, so they did get priority, they only used 2% of the available livers. And so their transplants only took up 2% of the available transplants that happened during the trial within the jurisdictions the trial was running. So it feels like us who don't do a lot of transplants that maybe we'd be using a lot of livers, but maybe we wouldn't be, compared with what's going on.
Well, I think it's a fascinating and changing space because, of course, the reduction in hepatitis with the vaccination, of course, is making a difference. And also my sister, who's Norwegian, or should I say married a Norwegian, they have compulsory donor status in their country, and you have to actively opt out of that, whereas ours is an opt-in system. And Norway has been one of the countries which has led in this area because they've had a compulsory system. And I think there's a lot to be said from that in terms of organ donation. My opinion, once you're gone, you're gone. And certainly having that kind of a system whereby your eyes and your kidneys and your liver could be used to save someone else's life would be a great thing to help someone else after you're gone.
Yeah. Interesting discussion. So see earlier comments about cost and, it's an interesting first world problem, isn't it, when we have published WHO essential oncology drug list, which most countries can't access. And here we are talking about liver transplants, but it would be interesting to see further follow-up and probably bigger studies to try and replicate the results. We've been burnt in the past with transplants in solid tumours, notably the breast cancer work that came out of South Africa. So I think it'll be a matter of probably waiting a bit longer before we jump on that bandwagon, but we'll see. Chris, what else happened?
Oh, Craig, do you think they're going to do that? Do you think they're going to repeat that study? I think the data from South Africa talking about breast cancer was about BMT and people who had no residual disease. This is about taking out the organ which has been affected and has got metastatic disease in it, more than 20 tumours. I don't think the studies are ever going to be repeated. I think now that's been done, no one's going to agree to be randomised.
Do you think so? So, no, my point being about a small study showing significant difference in a high intensity treatment. Yeah, I would want to see a bit more data, I would think. We're talking about 40 patients randomised into each arm. So that's a small study, right?
Yeah, but we're not talking about a 15% difference with a p-value of 0.04. We're talking about a p-value of 0.0000003, I think it was. It was something ridiculous. And a hazard ratio of 0.2. This is a stonking difference. And it's not subtle and it's consistent, and he could explain it. So, longer follow-up of these patients will be interesting, but most of the patients in the control arm are dead. So they can't get any better. That's what I'm saying. They can't miraculously do better later.
I think one of the other challenges of scientific research that you'll face is the scientific perfection, and then there's actually what you can achieve. And of course, in a scientifically perfect world, you would repeat the study, you'd have it in a large number of people, et cetera. But actually, ultimately, a jurisdiction has to agree that it's an ethical study and that you can actually proceed with that study in your jurisdiction, and patients have to agree to be randomised to that. And until, whilst transplantation is restricted, then sure, you might be able to randomise, but the results of this, I think, are likely to influence transplant centres.
Yeah. All right, Chris, what else happened in GI?
I think one of the problems I had with that last study was reconciling it with the Orchestra study, which was a study of multi-organ metastatic colorectal cancer who could have up to 80% of their tumours debulked, and most of them got 100. This was people who had metastatic disease in 3 sites or liver only, with parotid lymph node, adrenal or peritoneal disease. So these were people who had 3 sites of disease or 5 liver lesions plus one of those other high-risk sites. And they had to be 80% debulkable, and a third had less than 5 lesions. The fascinating thing about the Orchestra study was that there was no significant difference between the intervention arm, which was the debulking arm, and the chemotherapy-only arm, which is suggesting that 3-organ metastatic colorectal cancer or liver plus high-risk site is incurable and should be treated with systemic disease. Those with liver and lung had a median overall survival with chemotherapy 28 months, and with surgery plus chemotherapy plus debulking had 30 months, so no difference. With peritoneal disease, actually did better with chemotherapy, 26.9 versus 24.3, and those who were good responders to chemotherapy were still at 29 months versus 32 with major debulking. So adding major debulking with high morbidity and multivisceral disease was getting maybe 1 or possibly 2 months additional. And part of that is because people who undergo those radical procedures don't get back to chemo. And in actual fact, we should be saying 3-organ disease doesn't help people when you get to cytoreductive therapy. So you put that in the context of the liver transplantation, and what it's suggesting is that if you've only got 1 or 2 organs with colorectal cancer, that's worth an aggressive approach. 3 or more, or liver plus 1 other high-risk site, that probably remains incurable. So I found that really useful to help start to delineate some boundaries. For a while, we've had exenterative surgeons who've argued over pelvic exenteration with metastatic disease. Sites vary as to whether they will exenterate with another organ of disease. People who've done peritonectomies will vary as to whether they will also take on people with oligometastatic liver or lung disease also. But I think this is saying if you've got 3+, this study is really saying the benefits of further debulking with interventional approaches probably just isn't there.
Okay, thank you. Orchestra. And then anything else for us, Chris?
Checkmate 8HW is another study in dMMR colorectal cancer. Now, we know from Keynote 177 that people with dMMR colorectal cancer benefit from single-agent PD-1 inhibitor like pembrolizumab. They do better. 60% of people are cured. We know that with first-line data. So that is now the standard of care. Checkmate 8HW was Ipi-Nivo times 4, followed by Nivo, versus dealer's choice chemotherapy. It also had a Nivo-only arm, which I guess is comparable to 177. But that's not yet been reported. dMMR colorectal cancer. Patient characteristics are quite critical in this. A quarter had BRAF mutated status, 21% had NRAS or KRAS mutant status, and they were the ones who did really badly in Keynote 177. But a quarter had unknown status, so that's a big black hole in terms of what those patients were, and quite high for our community. Only 11% had Lynch, but a lot were unknown, of course. And so this, I think, represents more the patients who I see in my clinics, who are mostly dMMR but BRAF mutants, by and large, with only a small spattering of Lynch out there. What they found was with Ipi-Nivo versus chemotherapy, the 12-month PFS was massive, 80% with Ipi-Nivo, and at 24 months, 72%, which means if you've got disease control at 12 months, you are 90% likely to still be under disease control at 2 years, which is just huge. And with chemotherapy, it's 20% likely to be under control at 12 months. So look, I'm a complete PFS skeptic, and I really love seeing the OS data.
Yeah, I'm amazed that you're presenting this in a positive light, Chris. What's going on?
Look, but the gap in PFS is massive in that group. Of course, you attempted to do a cross-trial comparison between 177, which is the Pembro study, and Checkmate, which is the Nivo-Ipi, and you look at it numerically, of course, Ipi-Nivo's higher than Pembro, but of course there are differences in patient characteristics. There's a third arm, which is Nivo only, and we need to see how Ipi-Nivo compares to Nivo, because that's, patient selection in the same trials. We need to see what Ipi is adding, because of course it adds toxicity, but this is a pretty stonking PFS gain in that study. The hazard ratios make my eyes water. In BRAF mutants, the hazard ratio of 0.37, for example, which is certainly A+ in the ESMO magnitude of clinical benefit scale.
All right, and I'm surprised neither of you mentioned ESOPEC, so one of you going to talk to us about that before we wrap up GI?
Yeah, ESOPEC, of course, in esophageal cancer, of course, CROSS has been the topic du jour for a number of years in the GI oncology community, and it's discussed every week in the upper GI MDM. Of course, CROSS was a randomized study in adeno and squamous cell carcinomas of the esophagus, which looked at 5 weeks of carbotaxol, really low-dose carbo, AUC2, but every week, of course, so comparable exposure to 3-weekly AUC6, with paclitaxel at a dose of 50 mg per metre squared, so lower than what you would do if you had metastatic disease. And that was radiosensitization doses. 5 weeks compared to surgery alone, and it did improve overall survival. Our FLOT was a study predominantly of gastric cancer, so GOJ and gastric, and we did not have adequate data in esophageal cancer to say whether the FLOT regime actually worked. And this is in the background also where we had OEO2, 2 cycles of cisplatin, 5-FU, improved overall survival compared to surgery alone. And then we had OEO5, which was 4 cycles of EOX versus 2 cycles of CF, which was negative. So intensification of chemo in esophageal cancer previously had been negative. So I didn't necessarily think this was going to be a slam dunk. People said it was after Neo-Aegis, but actually it wasn't at all a slam dunk. And what the study shows headline is that FLOT is better than CROSS, and that's the headline. So I think for most people, it's going to displace that. There's quite a few complexities to the study, though, that are worth diving into. So for starters, 2/3 to 70% of people who had CROSS actually completed it. Now, that is really, really low. And CROSS is a low-intensity treatment for esophageal cancer. We know that people with esophageal cancer have nutritional issues. We know they often have comorbidities. We know they've often lost a lot of weight, so they are often a comorbid population. And high-intensity therapy in esophageal cancer is actually sometimes difficult to deliver. But CROSS, in my experience, has actually been quite a doddle. It's easy to deliver, but in actual fact, it was hard.
Chris, when they say not completed, it's one thing to finish the radiotherapy, but because of neutropenia, you've dropped out the paclitaxel in the last week. So that's a not completed. Are you saying 30% of the patients really didn't get their dose of radiotherapy, or do we have the details on that?
No, I don't think we've got the detail of that yet, Craig. And remember, esophageal cross is 41 gray of radiotherapy. So it is absolutely and utterly about downsizing the tumour slightly without increasing the leak rate. That's the purpose of the therapy. So it's a local regional therapy to allow you to get out. When we gave high-dose chemo rads preoperatively, like the STARL trial, for example, with esophageal cancer, using cisplatin 5-FU with doses of 50 plus gray, people leaked and they died. So intensification of preoperative therapy is not always a good idea because people suffer in the post-operative phase. So we've seen other studies whereby in the first year post-operatively, people with intensive neoadjuvant therapies tend to die. But I think for people who are fit for either cross or flot, it's now clear that flot is better. For people who are comorbid or who can't tolerate multi-agent chemotherapy, then cross is still going to remain an option. But, cross was a loco-regional treatment. Flot is a systemic treatment, and most people with esophageal cancer die of systemic disease. So, the king is dead, long live the king.
So in the pre-immunotherapy availability days in Australia, post-chemoradiotherapy, with people with residual disease, we give immunotherapy. But I've often thought the chemo that you give with the paclitaxel carbo low dose is not enough, and that's why, we're seeing these systemic relapses. So I'm not surprised by these results. But one of the problems we'll now have in Australia is if people getting flot and then have their surgery, they won't qualify for the immunotherapy post-operatively. So there's still a whole lot of work.
But we know that doesn't help, Craig. That trial has been done. So Prestige looked at post-flot, node positive or R1 resection, so the ones you're frightened about, and they randomised them into ipi-nivo versus completion of the flot, and the completion of the flot arm did better. Now, there is, of course, a missing arm, which is nothing at all. So what we're doing is the flot assisting, or is the ipi-nivo killing people? We don't know. But what we do know is that there isn't a role for IO in those patients with the data that we have currently. So the people are better off to complete the flot. Now, again, that went against my biases, which would have been that if you haven't done particularly well on flot, why give more? But the data that we have at the moment is that's what we should be doing. What study was that, Kate? I don't think I've read that. Prestige, VESTIGE. It was presented at ESMO GI last year. Albert was the lead author.
Prestige.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not surprised by the results, Chris, because I think more systemic treatment's better, but I still think there's going to be more trials to do. Kate? I
am fascinated because the difference between flot and cross and ESOPEC is about 10%. It's about the same difference that you see in MAGIC versus flot. So the addition of the taxane seems to be what's pushed the chemotherapy into the superior bit. So you give all of the good drugs up front, unless we start giving flot-airy, we can't give much more chemotherapy to these poor people up front. Yeah, so Craig and Chris are both pulling the best faces. Yeah, I've just invented flot-airy. I will never give it to anyone, but I'm sure somebody has tried. We can't give much more chemo. So I wasn't surprised myself, but I had previously held hope that maybe what we see in rectal cancer, which is that if you have excellent local control, you have excellent systemic control, maybe that's what we were seeing, but then that's been proven wrong. So I did a lot of eating humble pie this ASCO, but that's the wonderful thing about the job we do is that you're wrong all the time and you can get proven wrong. That's right. And God, we trust everyone else needs data. I think, there's a lot of future directions here, right? We could look at a rectal type approach with flot followed by cross, for example, followed by surgery. So there's other trials to do there. Addition of IO stratified according to your PD-L1 status. And of course, Kate, while you point out the Vestige study, which I need to read, demonstrated that IO is inferior to flot. We, of course, don't know about the combination, and the cardinal rule of medical oncology is if some is good, more is better. So let's chuck all the agents together, particularly if there's non-overlapping toxicities. I think the reality, though, is that many patients are not fit for flot, particularly those who have a lot of weight loss, particularly those who have a lot of comorbidity. And so we have to be careful here. I find chemotherapy gives people good responses in their swallow quite early on. And the other thing is that people in the global oncology community have been delighted by the study because actually radiotherapy globally isn't actually that accessible. And so they can deliver radiotherapy locally, and they've been really pleased that it's validated the role of chemotherapy being able to be given in your local community.
And if we want to learn from other cancers, we know that perioperative is probably the way to go. So I think there's a whole generation of studies incorporating FLOT plus pre-op immunotherapy and post-op as well. So great discussion. My take home from all this discussion about the GI today has been really about MDTs, right? So we've had discussion about debulking. Now might have discussions about transplants in selected patients. There's a whole area of discussion still in the esophageal cancer patients. Are they fit for FLOT? Is that what we're going to do? I think we now have options where you're going to individualize it in an individual patient according to the team's approach and your local circumstances. So very interesting ASCO, probably more questions than answers, but exciting to see all of that new data. So I think we're going to wrap up this episode and we're going to pick it up again real soon with the second post-ASCO look, concentrating on some lung, which was really pretty exciting data, and some data in melanoma and other tumours. If you're sick of listening to stuff about ASCO, I'd refer you to episode 5 of the OJC, which came out a couple of weeks ago and has had some really excellent feedback, including from Associate Professor Jeremy Shapiro in Melbourne, who reached out and said he was really enjoying the podcast, called into question my mantra that 3 drugs were better than 2 in prostate cancer, but he reminded me that in the low-risk patients, it should really be 2. I think if you listen again, that's what came across in the paper we presented, which was a summary of the data at the moment in advanced prostate cancer and the role of the new novel androgen receptor inhibitors. But thank you, Jeremy, for the feedback. It's great to hear that people are enjoying the podcast. So if you want a bit of a chuckle and also some educational material, listen to episode 5. So thank you both. I know you've both got some commitments tonight and it's getting late in New Zealand, so we'll just leave it at that. Thanks very much, and we'll see you again next week.
Craig, can I just check Jeremy Shapiro? Is that the guy who wore the Borat Mankini, rode a unicycle and did some juggling at AGITG one year?
Yeah, please don't. That triggers me if you mention that image, I think.
Jeremy, we need some more juggling Mankini YouTube videos soon.
No. Kate, thank you so much. I know you've got a big family celebration tonight, so thanks for finding time to record this and enjoy your evening.
No, thank you, Craig. So the idea of Jeremy Shapiro half naked just reminds me that I have witnessed Chris wearing nothing but a guitar. So,
oh, sure, that never happened. That never happened.
Oh dear. Well, I might leave it at that. Thank you, Rachel, behind the desk there.
Thank you, Rachel.
She's got a thumbs up, and we'll see you again next week. Bye, everybody.
Ciao.
Thank you for tuning in to the Oncology Journal Club Podcast, proudly brought to you by the Oncology Podcast, part of the Oncology Network. For healthcare professionals seeking regular news updates and insightful discussions, we invite you to join our community at oncologynetwork.com.au. Your free registration includes a complimentary subscription to our weekly publication, the Oncology Newsletter, a valuable resource to stay updated on the latest advancements in the field. We value your input and welcome your feedback and paper recommendations via our social media channels, email and website. Your insights help shape the conversation and drive the direction of future episodes. This is Rachel Babin signing off for the Oncology Journal Club Podcast.